Hi, good afternoon, everybody. We hope you enjoyed our musical number to get us oriented to the subject matter today. Welcome to Money, 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 How Gas Utilities Could Chase IRA Dollars. So my name is Carra Sahler. I'm a staff attorney with the Green Energy Institute here at Lewis and Clark Law School. For those of you unfamiliar with our work, we are a climate policy and energy law organization housed in the Environmental, Natural Resources, and Energy Law Department at the law school. We have a great group of experts with us today, and I'm really thrilled to welcome them here on this webinar. Hadley, Tallackson, and Dan Esposito, both policy analysts from Energy Innovation, and Senior Associate Alex Piper from RMI are here to share their perspectives and knowledge on what has been described as the most meaningful climate legislation ever passed in the United States. We've heard a lot about how the Inflation Reduction Act will help move the needle on greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and we're all very excited about that. But today we're going to talk about some of the pitfalls. The IRA provides a path, and we have to make sure our regulatory agencies and states stay on the path to achieving deep greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So throughout the presentation today, please feel free to enter your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We hope to save a little bit of time at the end of the presentations today and panel discussion to answer those questions, but we have a lot to get through. There's just an amazing amount of material here. I thought it might be helpful to set the stage a little bit for those of you unfamiliar with Oregon's climate policy in thinking about how the Inflation Reduction Act might help or hinder decarbonization efforts here. Then I'll turn it over to Alex to provide a quick overview of the possible opportunities available with proper implementation of the IRA. Hadley and Dan will discuss the hydrogen funding available in both the IRA and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And then we'll explore with all the panelists some of the ways we want to see the IRA implemented and how we might influence implementation. Next slide, please. So this is just a very quick overview. I have done webinars on each of these things. These are important climate policies in Oregon. HB 2021 is 100% clean energy for all, and it establishes clear greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets, aiming to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from the state's retail electricity mix by 2040. Oregonians receive their electricity from PGE, PacifiCorp, Idaho Power, or any one of 38 consumer-owned or publicly owned electric utilities. And this law applies only to Oregon's largest investor-owned utilities, or IOUs, which are PGE and PacifiCorp. And then on the other side, we have Oregon's Climate Protection Program. That is the product of rulemaking initiated by the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. The rules are intended to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from two categories of fossil fuel suppliers, so natural gas and transportation fuels. DEQ has set a cap, which lowers over time, requiring covered entities to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. The program does have a mechanism called Community Climate Investments, or CCIs, that covered entities can use to facilitate emissions reductions. Through CCIs, covered entities can pay a DEQ set fee, which will be used to fund projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions in environmental justice communities. These projects include deployment of clean energy technologies like EVs and high efficiency heat pumps. Next slide, please. Because it's always helpful to see how policies might operate in real life, here is one plan by a gas utility to comply with the Climate Protection Program. You can see that it anticipates energy efficiency, which is those sort of top bars at the very top. The demand is the sort of railroad track chunk dotted line. So the efficiency reductions, energy efficiency reductions are the top. So those are the kinds of appliances that gas utilities are hoping customers will use to lower their use of gas. And then it will replace methane with renewable natural gas, or as some people call it, factory farm gas, hydrogen, and synthetic gas. And so we'll be talking about a lot of those things here today. So you can stop that share and turn it over to Alex.
All right. Thank you for the introduction, Carra. This will be a pretty quick overview of just a few of the, biggest or some of the impactful sectors that the IRA provides a lot of funding and incentives for. So it's not going to be everything. Hopefully, it's relevant to our conversation today, but there's quite a bit more to cover. Bottom line, this is an absolutely transformative piece of legislation that provides historic investments in clean energy solutions. Implementation is going to be, that second half of making sure it lives up to the opportunity. So first, you may have seen this before. This sort of gives you just sort of the perspective of where we need to get to meet net zero by 2050. This only goes out to 2035 and gives you the perspective on achieving our 50% reductions by 2030, which is our target nationally. With current policy or previous to IRA policy, we were getting to roughly 26% reductions. Frozen policy 26%, and then with current policy pre-IRA, a little bit lower than that. The Inflation Reduction Act brings us to close to that goal. It does not bring us all the way there, so there's certainly still a lot of room to go. A lot of this modeling, I will say, was fairly conservative and is sort of, I'd say is completely dependent on sort of how the implementation process goes. So this is, best guess at what we could be achieving through these investments, but a lot is still up to state level action, community level action, and then further federal regulations and action going forward. So the 40% reduction benchmark is thrown around a lot. This breaks down sort of the sector by sector reductions as modeled out. As you can see, the power sectors is the largest, followed by transportation and then industry. And then you have buildings, other greenhouse gas reduction efforts, including, methane capture and methane leakage prevention, and then natural climate solutions with land sinks and conservation efforts. Broad strategy here, the investments made in the Inflation Reduction Act are going to make clean solutions cheaper than dirty solutions. That's sort of the bottom line. This is a bill that provides mostly carrot, almost no stick. And the idea is we're making clean solutions far more competitive and attractive in the marketplace, from transportation with vehicles to clean power with renewable incentives and tax credits to the appliance level electrification. And then we'll be talking about hydrogen and the industrial applications as well. On the electricity side, essentially the access to clean electricity with tax credits is going to be, unparalleled. The modeling shows that these credits make investing in renewable energy cheaper than ever as those cost scales continue to slide. Huge new components for this bill are direct pay for a lot of these tax credits to states, local governments, and nonprofits, which allows, for a lot more monetization of the tax credit than otherwise possible when tax equity was sort of the only route to monetizing these tax credits. And then a couple big investments I'll highlight: almost $13 billion for rural electrification and grants, and then $290 billion in loan authority through the Loan Programs Office, which essentially, provides government-backed loans for projects trying to achieve commercial scale. This gives you another breakdown on some of the huge electricity tax credits and the opportunities. Again, I mentioned that loan authority from the Loan Programs Office. I'm going to highlight the $5 billion for energy infrastructure reinvestment financing. So that's a specific pot of money that provides guaranteed loan financing for retooling and building clean energy infrastructure in the place of existing or retired fossil infrastructure. And that provides up to $250 billion in loan authority for that program. And then there's an additional $40 billion for the Loan Programs Office on top of what they already have to do all of the different investments that they do across sectors. Essentially, it's the government's way of providing the financing that the private market is not ready to invest in. The direct pay I mentioned, there's a new production tax credit for utility scale solar, whereas previously all they had option was the investment tax credit. I mentioned the rural support, and then the up to 50% income or investment tax credit for community solar for low income projects, and the extension of the residential solar tax credit as well. Just a quick note on how subnational organizations can take advantage of this, and this sort of gets into the implementation question. The direct pay creates a real incentive for communities, states, nonprofits, as well as municipal utilities to invest in their own clean energy projects in which they can own and monetize and benefit from those tax credits provided. For households, rooftop storage or rooftop solar and battery storage becomes far more lucrative, attractive. The battery storage component is now its own separate tax credit. It does not need to be paired with solar to benefit. That's a big change. And then we'll talk about PUCs a little later, but it really sort of changes the whole name of the game when it comes to integrated resource planning, understanding how electrification and new demand will look, understanding the pricing of clean energy investment versus traditional fossil investment. So there's a lot of opportunity for PUCs and utilities to engage in a very different way with these investments. Getting into buildings, there's a number of building electrification and efficiency investments, including low and moderate income focused investments that are both expanding upon already existing tax credits and brand new programs that are really exciting. For existing tax credits, you have 45L, which is the new energy efficient home tax credit. And it's not a new tax credit, it's for new homes, up to $5,000 per unit. You have the residential energy efficiency tax credit, which allows residents to claim up to $1,200 per year in energy efficient appliances that they invest in their homes. And that does not account for an extra $2,000 that they can claim for the investment in a heat pump for their home. So it's up to $3,200 per taxable year in tax credit they can take advantage of for home efficiency and electrification. Then there's 179D, which is the commercial buildings deduction for energy efficiency upgrades, and that can be up to $5 per square foot with prevailing wage requirements met. These are brand new state-run grant programs, and there's 2 of these, adding up to $9 billion in total, including a contractor training piece. The first one is the High Efficiency Electric Home Rebate Program. We're calling that the Appliance Electrification Program or Home Electrification Program. Shorten that up a little bit. That essentially is a point of sale rebate for individuals making less than 120% of the area median income when they're buying a number of qualified electric appliances. That includes heat pumps, it includes water heaters, it includes breaker boxes, sort of the suite of technologies that needed to electrify one's home. There's now point of sale rebates for each of those things. And I think it's up to $14,000 per year allowed for those rebates. So really valuable, and that's targeted for low and moderate income households specifically. The second program here is the Home Energy Performance-Based Whole Home Rebates. HOMES is sort of the shorthand for that one. And that is actually an energy efficiency rebate program, which provides different levels of rebate for demonstrated efficiency improvements. So that can either be a modeled efficiency improvement in which someone changes, gets new insulation and changes windows and there's a modeling system that shows that that performance upgrade is going to lead to X% less energy use through a year. They would get a rebate for that up to $4,000 for that work. And there's also a demonstrated and measured approach where you actually measure before and after the efficiency upgrades. Each of those rebates are doubled for low and moderate income households, providing a lot more incentive to address our lower and moderate income housing stock. And finally, there's a number of other building incentives included. So there's further building code implementation, which adds on to infrastructure bill building code incentives. There's HUD, housing and urban development, housing energy improvements. The contractor training piece I mentioned is really important. That's $200 million to support all of our contractor base to understand how to install heat pumps. What's the difference? What's the, the importance for upgrading electrical paneling in order to access these new electrification rebates. So that's a really critical piece. There's a huge investment in federal buildings, and then low embodied carbon labeling for all of these products.
Alex, before you move to the next slide, do you mind going back? It occurred to me that with this slide up, it might be really easy for you to point out where gas appliances might qualify.
Sure, yeah. So they can qualify for the 25C tax credit. They can qualify for the home energy performance-based, that bottom one in the new state-run grant programs. And they certainly could apply for the 179D as well, depending, I think, on the upgrade. I think it's probably less common, but that would also be a place where they would qualify. Again, options or opportunities for subnational organizations to now take advantage of these credits. Households, there's unprecedented opportunity for individuals to take advantage both tax credit and rebate programs. There's estimates that across the United States, customers could save $5 billion in energy savings as a result of these upgrades made to their homes from efficiency and electrification. Businesses for that commercial, efficiency tax credit increase. Developers, obviously, this is a huge opportunity, and the training piece becomes really important. And then cities and states with low and moderate income investment, this can braid and stack really well with existing programs and integrate with what's already working and sort of help maximize that opportunity. And I'll pass over to Dan and Hadley for the next part of the presentation.
Thanks, Alex. Give me one moment while I get this set up. All right, folks can see the screen all right? Thank you. And thank you, Carra, for that introduction and laying the stage as to why we're having these conversations and bringing hydrogen into the conversation alongside the IRA provisions. So just to give a little bit of level setting on hydrogen, as it was one of the key solutions or emissions reduction pathways that Carra indicated earlier with a gas strategy for decarbonization, it would be helpful to just have a common foundation on hydrogen and what this fuel is and how it's different, importantly, from methane natural gas. So hydrogen is the lightest element in the universe, and the molecule H2 is the smallest molecule, and it's scarce in the Earth's atmosphere. So unlike methane, where you retrieve that from existing deposits, hydrogen you produce, and we'll talk about the production a little bit more. But also, as some chemical factors to hydrogen, it's a colorless, odorless gas. It's also highly flammable. This visual on the right shows the difference in flame visibility between a propane flame and hydrogen, with hydrogen on the right. And the point being here that a hydrogen flame is invisible in daylight and at nighttime very, very difficult to see. So that's another consideration with just the chemical properties of hydrogen and integrating it into existing infrastructure for gas. When hydrogen is burned with air, It emits mostly water as well as nitrogen oxides, which are an air pollutant that are hazardous to health and can damage lungs. And when hydrogen is emitted into the air, while hydrogen itself is not a greenhouse gas, its presence in the atmosphere increases the concentration of other greenhouse gases. So it causes an indirect warming effect, which is around 10 times the intensity of carbon dioxide. So that's just a little bit of foundation on hydrogen fuel. To speak a little bit about the production pathways that I mentioned, it's a produced fuel. So right now, 95% of the hydrogen used in the US today is produced using a method that's called gray hydrogen. There's this whole color scheme for different types of hydrogen. So that's how I'll speak about it. Gray hydrogen refers to steam methane reformation, which is a process that uses methane as an input to produce hydrogen. And you can see this graphic on the right includes emissions intensities of different hydrogen production pathways, with gray hydrogen, or SMR, on the left-hand side of that graph. So it has the highest emitting potential of hydrogen production pathways. Blue hydrogen is the same process as gray hydrogen, but you add a carbon capture step. And so that gets you this on the graphic on the right, with the column with the blue circle, that shows you the difference in emissions intensities if you add a carbon capture step, but that can vary based on methane leakage, carbon capture efficacy. So there's not a guaranteed universal emissions limit for blue hydrogen. And green hydrogen is the hydrogen that we typically talk about as a clean or zero emissions hydrogen. That uses a different process in which you input renewable electricity and water, and you output hydrogen and no carbon emissions. So that's where you can see over on the right-hand side of this graph, you have zero life cycle emissions based on the DOE's outline of emissions intensities for hydrogen.
But Hadley, just to confirm, with respect to all of those colors, you're going to have the same issues that you identified on the previous slide. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you for adding that clarification. So this slide talks specifically about greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production of hydrogen, but all of the points I spoke to earlier apply to hydrogen at all levels. Once you produce it, all of those other factors still apply. Thank you, Carra. And so while we're talking about IRA funding, we also wanted to quickly note the funding in IJA for hydrogen, the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, because there has been substantial funding around hydrogen, and it's just good to keep that context in mind as we talk about the other pieces of hydrogen funding in IRA. So in IJA, there is $8 billion in funding for hydrogen hubs, and the idea around the hydrogen hubs is there will be designated areas to explore and research different aspects of hydrogen. The funding requires what they refer to as end-use diversity and feedstock diversity. So at least one of the hubs must look at each of these end uses of power generation, using hydrogen for power generation, using hydrogen in industry and industrial applications, hydrogen for transport, and then also for heating in commercial and residential buildings. And not all hubs have to cover each of these, but at least one hub has to cover each of these, or at least one of these. And then similar need for diversity on feedstock side of things. So the hub funding must cover research around fossil fuel-based hydrogen production, renewable-based hydrogen production, as well as using nuclear to produce hydrogen. And we're already seeing an influx of proposals around where we'll get this funding. And I'll just note quickly that the clean hydrogen funding, or the clean hydrogen designation as defined in this funding, is looking at emissions around 4 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen. That's a little less than half of the emissions of the gray hydrogen production, just to give some level setting of what that looks like. And I'm going to turn it over to Dan to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the IRA with respect to hydrogen funding.
Thank you, Hadley. And yeah, so segueing from that, the infrastructure law is really primarily a research and development law. So a lot of these hydrogen hubs are meant to demonstrate, or at least first test hydrogen's viability in these different from these different feedstocks and for these different end uses. The Inflation Reduction Act, its support for hydrogen is almost entirely in its 45V clean hydrogen production tax credits. And this is much more about deployment. And so these credits have different values for producing hydrogen based on the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions associated with their production. So as Hadley mentioned, the vast majority of hydrogen produced today through steam methane reformation has about 9 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen produced. There's a little bit of variation there, but that's kind of the benchmark that we think about. The tax credit buckets shown here, there's 4 of them, 60 cents a kilogram, 75 cents a kilogram, $1 a kilogram, and $3 a kilogram. Those are defined, their definitions are tied to the life cycle emissions on a kilogram of CO2 equivalent per kilogram hydrogen basis, with those numbers in the upper half of the x-axis there. On the bottom half of that x-axis is showing estimates of how much carbon you would have to capture if you are producing this hydrogen in the blue hydrogen pathway that Hadley had described with carbon capture and storage. So you can see for this largest production tax credit value of $3 a kilogram, you would need to capture more than 95% of the CO2 emissions. And that's assuming that there's no upstream methane emissions, which is a really significant problem. So in our estimation, any natural gas-based hydrogen production is unlikely to qualify for this biggest credit value because it's not realistic to have no methane leakage. And there's not really anything out there that can capture more than 95% of carbon emissions right now, aside from some new technologies being piloted, such as pyrolysis. Won't get into that right now. But by and large, it's broadly expected that only green hydrogen will be able to qualify for this bucket of being at 0.45 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen. So that means that this green hydrogen process, again, from renewable electricity used to split water through the process of electrolysis, that hydrogen looks to have at least a $2 a kilogram subsidy over any other type of clean hydrogen production based on this law's definition of clean, that is. So it's, and to maybe also add another point of context, most of the hydrogen produced today is about $1 or $2 per kilogram from that steam methane reformation process. Blue and green hydrogen today are much more expensive, but they are also very regionally specific, based on natural gas prices, and for green hydrogen based on the resource quality available from wind and solar, as well as things like access to water supply. And so the cheapest green hydrogen today, it changes, but I believe it was somewhere around $4 a kilogram in the Pacific Northwest. And so if you have a $3 a kilogram value, all of a sudden you're competitive tomorrow, which is crazy, because for a long time we were expecting electrolyzer capital costs, which is one of the main determinants of the cost of green hydrogen, to fall over time. But we were still thinking realistic discussions of green hydrogen production at scale were 10 or more years out. And with the Inflation Reduction Act, depending on tax guidance issues that we'll get into later in this webinar, it could be competitive again as soon as tomorrow. So there's still a lot that the Treasury will have to work out in order to get some clarity on how exactly you qualify for these different credit buckets. But the main point is that green hydrogen is looking really attractive right now. And yeah, the industry could be shifting overnight depending on how this all gets defined in practice. So I think I'll leave it there for now and turn things back to Carra for some questions.
Yeah, thanks. Dan, did you want to talk a little bit about carbon capture now, or should we just wait? Let's wait and we'll explore
Sure.
during our questions. So just fascinating. I've been jotting down additional questions as you've been talking based on your slides. We've broken up these questions in buckets. So just to kind of help think about how we anticipate pieces of the IRA and IIJA being used. But so starting with thinking about, buildings. So a question for Hadley, what's the best way for a state to roll out IRA benefits that capitalize on the best parts of the bill?
Well, I'll start by focusing on the building provisions that Alex laid out earlier. And particularly, states will be accountable for rolling out the rebate programs, both the homes modeled and measured efficiency upgrade programs, as well as the electrification programs, in addition to the state contractor programs as well, and the building code programs that are also receiving funding in IRA. So those are some of the things that the states will be looking at and needing to figure out how to develop programs to release those funding to customers in the state. I would say the first thing that states can do to be on top of developing these programs and using the money most efficiently is to stay on top of the timing with the release of these fundings to states and remain engaged with the DOE on the development of the guidance around each of these funding buckets. So for the contractor trainings, there will be an RFI released request for information that states can provide input to on program styles and what works best and what they've seen work in their state before. That will be released around mid-December. And in January or February of next year, there will be an RFI for the rebate programs, and states can really provide input on what they would like to see in terms of being able to design their own state programs and taking best practices that they've learned in their states. These rebates will be kind of complicated to implement based on the fact that there are two different rebate pools. There are income eligibility requirements that states will need to work with DOE to figure out how to determine those easily and smoothly while maintaining data privacy of customers, and also making sure these hoops to jump through to get the rebates are low barriers to entry for low income households that are eligible for the electrification rebates and for the additional rebate for the efficiency funding. So there are a lot of things that states need to be thinking about navigating, including that verification of income eligibility, keeping track of the of the rebates as they get distributed to make sure that you're not seeing rebates overlap for the same project upgrade, which is not allowed under the IRA. You could couple these rebates for different projects and efficiency upgrades, but they cannot both cover the same upgrade. Also thinking about concerns around or best practices around modeling efficiency savings for the homes rebate. So there's a lot of these nuances in how these programs will actually function that states should begin proactively thinking about and remain engaged with the DOE with as they begin that process of developing guidance. And states should also begin thinking about their interagency coordination within the state, because funding will be coming through for multiple different programs, and having personnel dedicated to keeping an eye on all of these different programs and funding streams, rather than asking each program to maintain their program while also knowing how it can fit in with all of the other programs. I think just allocating personnel well there to make sure that somebody's in charge of keeping track of all of these, and so it's not on each program to do that full picture look at how the funding is getting deployed.
That's a great idea, Hadley. Have you talked to states that are thinking about implementing that particular component of where you have sort of a central agency or person that's responsible for kind of tracking the funding that's coming through?
That's not a conversation I've had with states in particular, but I know there's dedicated funding for implementation within each of these rebates. So I think if that's something that states are interested in, it's definitely a prime opportunity to submit that in the comment period in January or February, or when that RFI is released. And I'm sure that's something the DOE is thinking about too, like what does this actually look like from a staff and personnel perspective. And the last thing I'll add here is just making sure these rebates are simple and accessible to customers will be critical to make sure they actually have the impact. That is the goal, particularly on the electrification program side that's targeting low and moderate income folks and households. Those are typically customer groups that have are under enrolled in programs that are designed to support them, because there's a communication gap and those barriers are not worked through on the state level to get those folks enrolled. So really paying attention to reaching those customers and focusing on whole efficiency upgrades for them so they receive the benefits of efficiency and electrification will be very important.
So I can see that there's a lot on our state agency plates, and you've got a lot of great ideas for them. That makes me wonder about sort of the pitfalls that we highlighted. You know, when I had Alex pause on that slide and point out where gas appliances might be selected by customers. So are there opportunities, Alex, for advocates to influence what's considered a qualifying appliance? And that's the sort of the legal term under the law for either the rebate or the tax credits at either the federal or state level?
I think the opportunity for states to influence kind of what applies for these rebates is somewhat limited. The electrification rebate program lists out what the opportunities are there, and that's not anything that's gas powered, so that there's not really an issue there. On the Homes Act, there's actually no description of kind of what qualifies, which in legalese essentially means anything, you know, as long as the terms are met, as long as the efficiency targets are met. And so that's why I sort of say it's limited impact. I think the opportunities that states will have, and I totally agree with Hadley's point about keeping on top of some of these deadlines and timelines, will be the Department of Energy's process of intaking comment and recommendations over the next few months. So the Department of Energy is going to have to put out guidance for states to say, here's what we're looking for, here's what we think would be a strong program. States, you let us know what your program is going to look like, and then we'll approve it and give you the money. They're going to have 2 different listening sessions over the next roughly 2 months, you know, probably December and maybe early January, maybe both in December, but in which they will ask stakeholders to provide feedback on how they want to see these programs run. And then they'll start a formal RFI, or request for information process, in which they ask everybody to provide feedback to specific questions that they have. And that's going to be a key question for DOE, is going to be, how do we incentivize, you know, climate beneficial, you know, electrification without doing anything we can't do by the letter of the law? So that I don't think that they would be able to say this is an electrification only program, given the way the law is written. In some cases, that might make sense too. And they can, you know, provide encouragement to states, or provide certain application pathways for states that want to do electrification only. That's all opportunities for states to comment during these next few months and say, it would be great for our state, who is, you know, pushing electrification, who can provide, you know, further incentives to make this affordable for folks that do electrify. We have all these benefits. We would love an opportunity from, or you know, a sort of guidance from DOE on how to present an application that works within the way the program has to operate. So over the next 2 months, I think is really the key opportunity to provide that feedback to DOE, and there will be formal channels to do so opening soon. We don't have dates on those listening sessions. We don't have date on the requests for information, but they will certainly be publicizing that. And that's really the key kind of opportunity to make that impact.
Yeah, that's great. My next question was the biggest concern you have for existing provisions, but I see a question from our participant that sort of maybe gets at some of this. And the question is, because some of the IRA credits incentives apply to high efficiency natural gas appliances, is there concern that those programs could entrench gas reliance? Do you expect gas industry stakeholders to promote gas appliances over electric appliances?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly a reality, and we're going to see quite a bit of that. I think again, going back to sort of the thesis of the Inflation Reduction Act is that we are making, electrification more affordable. We are making our electric grid cleaner with cheaper electricity. And so I think the argument needs to be sort of counteracted with, the evidence that suggests that we have a cleaner and cleaner grid, which makes electrification a climate solution. And we now have all these rebates and incentives that make electrification more affordable within the home in a way that they maybe haven't been to this date. And then you combine that with, the strong arguments of health and comfort in the home that electrification provides. And that sort of creates a really strong counter argument. But I think that the concern of, gas appliances being entrenched through some of these tax credits and rebates is certainly realistic. When the Homes Act was being drafted originally, it's tricky because you're designing something that's supposed to apply to the entire country, and some states do not have electrification programs ready to deploy. You have different electricity and natural gas pricing state by state, which sort of changes the economics. And the opportunity to provide, more efficient, safer appliances in homes is one in which some states will look to for gas appliances and not electric appliances at this moment. It's somewhat of a reality of the case, but certainly the concern remains that does entrench appliances, and gas utilities and gas companies will be pushing to use that and to advertise in that sense. And that's sort of the opportunity for advocates and states to sort of push back with strong arguments.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks, Alex. Hadley, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just like to add everything that Alex outlined is completely something that we need to be careful about. And I think an area that will be really important to avoid as much as possible some of these concerns about entrenching in more gas infrastructure and gas appliances will really be on the state energy offices programs, building out comprehensive customer and consumer education programs that show why this shift is important and how it helps the customers and their households operate more efficiently and more comfortably for their own home comfort. This is a deviation from the historical experience of mostly relying on gas infrastructure in some places. So really taking the time to inform customers about what this change is and how it benefits them, and making sure they have that information to take advantage of the tax credits and the rebates that work best for them, and not defaulting into a gas appliance upgrade because it's what they know.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Thanks, Hadley. So much to unpack here. We could talk about this subject alone, and we could certainly talk about the next subject alone, and maybe we'll have a future webinar just on hydrogen because there's so much to explore here. But I mean, all this conversation about beneficial electrification naturally brings up the question that I have, which is, why isn't hydrogen a useful gas to heat our homes and water? Why shouldn't we be using it in our buildings?
Yeah, and I can jump in there. So given a couple of the points I outlined on hydrogen and its general qualities as a fuel, so factors around its small size leads to a lot of leakage in the gas infrastructure and in homes. Leakage is already a concern with methane, but the even smaller size of hydrogen means that increased leakage is likely. Its propensity to be more volatile and explosive is also a concern in homes and infrastructure. Hydrogen can self-ignite when released from high pressure pipelines. So there's a lot of safety concerns just in terms of hydrogen fitting within this existing infrastructure. There's also the concerns around increased NOx emissions when you add that into when you add that into buildings. The NOx emissions from hydrogen are higher than natural gas, and so you have these health and safety risks. At the same time, you're not seeing many climate benefits because hydrogen is a less dense fuel compared to methane. For blending a 20% amount of hydrogen into a gas distribution system, which is something that utilities have been proposing or exploring as the maximum blend limit, a 20% hydrogen blend yields only a 7% emissions reductions from carbon emissions. And you also get potential secondary warming effects from hydrogen leakage in that process. So the climate benefit is minimal, and you max out pretty quickly on the amount of hydrogen you can put in a system, if at all, due to the safety risks. Meanwhile, there's already a pathway that's available and viable in electrification, and there are a lot of factors that need to be figured out in the deploying of that to make sure solutions are resilient, but this is a solution that has already been deployed and it works, and it doesn't have all of these concerns that
Yeah, that's great. So Dan, I think that sort of tees you up, I think, to answer, so we obviously have a federal government that thinks that there is a place for hydrogen. How should the IRA and EJA be used to support responsible hydrogen development?
Yeah, and so there's a lot of attention paid right now to hydrogen as it can be used by gas utilities to decarbonize buildings. And for the reasons Hadley laid out, we do not think that that is a wise path to go down for a whole host of reasons. But it doesn't mean that hydrogen is bad in and of itself. In fact, we will almost certainly need zero carbon hydrogen in a range of processes, including as a feedstock for things like fertilizer production or to create hydrogen-derived fuels that also burn without greenhouse gas emissions, like ammonia, which could help us decarbonize our ports. In fact, I was just at the Port of Long Beach yesterday, talking to their director of sustainability on how they are looking to green hydrogen to help them decarbonize those processes of just lifting and moving all those containers on, just offshore, where the amount of energy they need is so immense that it's really difficult to electrify. Whereas, you can use hydrogen powered forklifts that just put things through a fuel cell and don't result in any NOx emissions or anything. And then have that energy density that you need for those processes. Like there are certain things where batteries, may develop to become more energy dense, but you can't really have a lithium ion marine, like commercial shipping vessel for international trade. You just would need way too many batteries to make it worthwhile, and so we'll need some sort of energy dense system to make that work. And hydrogen or hydrogen derived fuels look to be promising. And so these are the exact areas where the DOE hydrogen hubs should really be focusing their attention. Are these solutions? If so, how would they work? Unfortunately, it's written into the infrastructure law that they also need to explore residential and commercial heating, which I think is kind of an oversight. But the recommendation there would be, instead of having a hub where you're blending hydrogen in the pipelines or designing consumer appliances that can burn hydrogen or anything like that, they should be looking to more creative ways to use that money in a way that still fits that definition. So one example would be a lot of cities, especially out east, have district heating systems where you burn gas and generate power to feed your city, but you also have waste heat that you can send through pipelines to a lot of the buildings in the area. A lot of college campuses do this as well. So that might be an area where green hydrogen could make sense for the dual purpose of providing heat and power. I haven't looked into it enough to know how it all shakes out, but that would be a much more reasonable thing to explore with these hubs than blending in pipelines.
That's
And
wonderful. Thank you. I
yeah,
think maybe we could have Alex and Dan kind of answer some questions. I know that both of you are engaged in a number of commenting opportunities with a number of agencies that are exploring these issues. Can you talk about what each agency is doing and what you're hoping to achieve in your comments? And we have a question here too from one of our attendees about states having an opportunity to comment. And is there also an opportunity for utilities to engage in these processes?
yeah, so maybe I can start and pass it over to you, Alex. So the main type of commenting happening right now on the hydrogen production side for both of these laws is how do you define the carbon emissions intensity of different production pathways on a life cycle basis. So for things like burning gas and capturing emissions with carbon capture, there are relatively standard approaches to this that have already been spelled out to some degree. They'll still need some refining. But the bigger challenge is electrolysis is an entirely separate process. And if you are, say you're connecting an electrolyzer to the power grid and using that power to produce hydrogen, how do you know what the emissions intensity is of the electricity that you're using? Because that counts for life cycle emissions of the hydrogen that you're producing. We, both of our organizations and several others have been looking into this, and there's a big risk that if you set standards too loose, then you can actually dramatically increase greenhouse gas emissions and then claim that you're producing green hydrogen. And a lot of that has to do with which power plants are ramping up their generation when you are drawing power from the grid to feed your electrolyzer. And is your production spurring the build out of new renewables, or are you just taking in renewable electricity from existing plants and that's backfilled then by new fossil energy? There's a lot of important components to this, but if you get it right, you can build out a robust system of hydrogen production that can go and then feed end uses like fertilizer production and cleaning up our ports and maybe airports and things of that nature. But if you get it wrong, then these tax credits are so lucrative that you can see a massive build out of electrolyzers and worsen emissions pretty dramatically, just from the production side, without even considering how it gets used downstream. Alex, do you want to touch on maybe some of the principles or how states can engage?
Yeah, no, that was a perfect kind of description. I'll also just kind of highlight the secondary tricky just policy implementation layer of this is that these are tax credits. So Department of Treasury is the one that needs to write the regulations for this. And obviously this is extremely complicated and sort of cutting edge stuff that we don't expect our Treasury Department necessarily have the expertise. So we're relying on them to consult with the Department of Energy, who does sort of house a lot of these experts. But that coordination process, and the end of the day, Treasury having to put out regulations for the guidance of how to qualify facilities for this tax credit is really critical, and is sort of that second layer consideration that we're trying to make as we describe, as we try to outline sort of the pros and cons of different pieces there. So some of the principles, we've been thinking about, the matching of the load in which you are drawing power to create hydrogen with clean power is really critical. So whether that is an hourly matching opportunity or an annual matching opportunity, that is a huge distinction. And we are arguing for extremely granular matching. Whether or not the power that you are using, like Dan said, is new clean power or is being pulled from something else, and therefore you can't electrify as many buildings or as much transportation, which are all things that we know are coming and need to be electrified quickly. And then finally, where is that power coming from? Is it nearby, and are you decarbonizing the grid in which you are inducing this huge hydrogen load? Or is this, in a different grid, different region, potentially, not even serving new load because of congestion or other reasons? So there's pretty big fundamental questions. And these are also, like fundamental questions to just carbon emissions accounting and our power grid in general. So the fact that we're sort of combining that with hydrogen, which has its own sort of complications and interesting nuances in feedstock and use cases is a particularly thorny challenge. And so we're trying to navigate both the public commenting process, the request for information process, as I mentioned before, with meetings with officials, engagement with other experts and stakeholders and developers, and trying to build expertise quickly and provide feedback quickly to the federal government, because they are statutorily bound to provide regulations by next August. And there's currently an RFI process open with some of those big questions due in just a couple of weeks. So this is sort of a, mad dash on some really big questions. And a lot of hope. I'm glad a lot of really smart people like Dan and Hadley are on top of the case, because we're going to need it.
Alex, I was just about to say the same thing, that I feel some comfort that you all are engaged in this process. And I was just going to offer Dan's kind a willingness to share the comments that you all have submitted already. So we'll follow up the webinar not only with a recording of this, but also links to the comments that you've submitted so folks can dig in a little bit deeper. Hadley, we've got just 2 minutes. This went way too fast. So I'd love to hear your point. And then I'll just say, Dan, I think we might have to have you back to talk about carbon capture and sequestration, because there are some really, really, really important questions there to unpack. But Hadley, why don't you pop in with your last point, and then we'll thank you all for coming.
Yeah, happily. Thank you, Carra. So to touch a bit on the utility piece outside the realm of hydrogen specifically, I just want to tie together the high level picture that IRA is changing the business as usual. And if utility regulators are operating with the same tools and same expectations about what they'll see from utilities, that will lead to a gap between what the IRA is striving to achieve and what it actually achieves. So for example, with all of the funding directed towards specifically electrification programs and efficiency programs that favor the higher efficiency overall of electrification over gas. If gas utilities are still planning to meet that same demand with gas, while electric utilities are planning to increase their supply in order to meet higher electrification adoption, there's going to be a system overbuild of gas that regulators need to keep a strong eye on and remain aware of, and making sure those overall planning pathways for gas and electric utilities converge, so ratepayers aren't paying extra costs. And that's my last point.
That's a
Thanks
great
for letting me
place
sneak
to
it in
end. For all the advocates on the phone, pay attention to what these folks are saying. We'll follow up with a recording and links to the comments. And then please do follow up with any questions that you might have to gei@lclark.edu. Happy to try and get answers for you. And we do have some open questions, which I promised Ryan we would follow up by email if we can give him some answers. That'd be great. Thank you all so much. This was really a wonderful experience, wonderful working with you all. Thanks for pivoting and being available so quickly, and for sharing your expertise today. Thank you.